Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. I've been a big advocate for medical cannabis for many years now. We use it in our clinic with patients in California with great success, and I think it's a potent and very promising medicine for a number of different conditions, ranging from the conditions it's best known for, like supporting patients who are going through chemotherapy, one of its longest term uses in medicine, to Parkinson's disease, to chronic inflammatory, neurodegenerative conditions, to chronic pain, to insomnia, to depression and anxiety. And unfortunately, in the US, the use of medical cannabis has been highly stigmatized until quite recently, and there was even a ban on researching it for any medicinal use, which is just insanity in my view, given the potential that this medicine has and how well tolerated it is by most people. Certainly, as with any other substance, there is potential for abuse, but when it's used appropriately and strategically, it can be a huge asset in a wide range of conditions, as I just mentioned. It's also not under the supervision or patent of big pharma, which is perhaps one reason why it hasn't been as readily available as it might otherwise be. There's not a big financial incentive for pharmaceutical companies in the case of this treatment. And I'm really excited to see that it's now starting to get the attention that I think that it deserves. A number of books have been published. There's more research happening, and in many states, medical marijuana is permitted with a prescription, and of course, in some states, you can get it without a prescription. So today, we're going to be talking with Dr. Mikhail Kogan. He is a leader in the newly established field of integrative geriatrics. He's a chief editor of the first definitive textbook of this field called Integrative Geriatric Medicine, which was published by Oxford University Press as part of Andrew Weil Integrative Medicine Library series. And he's a frequent speaker at a variety of international conferences on the topics of integrative medicine, geriatrics, healthy aging, as well as medical cannabis, which is going to be the topic we're going to discuss today. Dr. Kogan's main medical cannabis expertise is in treating older patients, the geriatric population, and in palliating symptoms at the end of life. But he also treats a wide range of internal medicine problems, from chronic GI issues to cancers, where the use of medical cannabis can also be beneficial. Dr. Kogan has a new book out in October now of 2021 called Medical Marijuana, Dr. Kogan's Evidence-Based Guide to the Health Benefits of Cannabis and CBD. And that's going to be the focus of our discussion today. So hope you enjoy the interview, and I hope that you or someone in your life can benefit from this information, because as I said before, as a clinician, I've seen huge benefits in using medical cannabis with patients that are a good fit for it. So let's dive in. Dr. Kogan, welcome to the show. I've really been looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Happy to join.
So I'd love to hear just a little bit more about how you got interested, particularly in using medical cannabis in general, and then medical cannabis in the geriatric population that you specialize in working with.
Yeah, so in 2012, Andrew Weil asked me to join the new formed American Board of Integrative Medicine as one of the founding board members. And Donald Abrams was there with me. And then basically exactly at the same time, DC passed the medical cannabis law. And in 2012, they started the process of registering patients. So I kind of, on one hand, I became pretty close friends with one of the grandfathers of the whole field. And also it just kind of got pushed into doing this. And I always tell everybody, in geriatrics, unfortunately, the motto is de-prescribe. And, we're all quite well aware that so many older patients are on so many medications. And I don't really have any better tool than cannabis for probably a third of all geriatric problems. Not just symptoms. I'm talking about actual management of problems too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a pretty incredible statement on the surface. Given, I think the statistics are something like the average 65-year-old is on at least five medications, if I recall.
Oh,
And
you're exactly right. And
yeah,
something like 30% of people over 65 take more than five medications. Like, think about this. It's mind-boggling, right? Because even if they don't take any other supplements or any other over-the-counter medications, it's still just the amount of interactions and potential side effects is crazy. And actually, the last year or maybe 2 years ago, the medications, appropriately prescribed medications, became the third most common death
cause of death.
cause of death in people over 50. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm aware of Barbara Starfield, when she was alive, was studying that at Berkeley. Had published a lot on iatrogenic events, as you just mentioned, being one of the major causes of death. Some, even in that paper you just referenced, I believe they suspected that, that because of underreporting, it may actually be the number one cause of death if those iatrogenic events were fully reported, which again is, I don't think it's an indictment of individual physicians who are largely doing their best. I think it's more, if anything, an indictment of the care model
I'll
that we have.
Think of it this way: the conservative estimate, and as you said, it probably is way off, but conservative estimate is somewhere around 250,000 people per year. So it's in 2 years, roughly, or 3 years, it's basically the cost of entire pandemic. And we don't really talk about this every year, as if there's this massive elephant in the room that's nobody talks about it. It's just the sort of, for everybody, it's just the cost of doing business,
Right.
and when I started practicing, I was like, well, I really want to learn tools that are, not that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've experienced this personally with people in my life. My grandfather several years ago, and then most recently my aunt, who is at the end of her life and is taking 7 or 8 different medications and is suffering greatly. And I, as a clinician myself, I know that a large part of her suffering actually is related to the side effects and the interactions of the medications that she's taking. But the doctor's response is it's generally to prescribe another medication to try to deal with those side effects, which of course becomes this vicious cycle where more and more medications are added, more interactions, more side effects. And it's like this treadmill that becomes very difficult for elderly people to get off of, which I'm sure
Yeah,
better than anybody else.
that's probably half of work we do in a hospital. When patients show up with problems, half of what we do is, what can we stop here?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what, in addition to this issue that we're talking about, maybe interactions of medication or overprescription and not adequate supervision, what are some of the other issues in the geriatric population that were not being adequately addressed with the standard of care?
Well, I mean, Chris, this is not a typical podcast, right? So I think we can talk frankly.
Yes, absolutely.
I've been following Dale Bredesen work, and actually we co-published a number of papers together. And, like, we know that the cognitive impairment process, whether it's Alzheimer's or others, is basically completely unmanaged, and any FDA-approved medications for Alzheimer's disease are a joke. So when we have approaches in integrative functional medicine that are extremely effective, I mean, to the point that in our own clinic, we already have dozens of patients who are totally recovered from Alzheimer's disease and stay recovered for years, 3, 4, 5 years. And so, that's totally untouched. I'm personally fascinated of the role that cannabis can play in this sort of a smaller area of geriatric care, because, we do know that for advanced Alzheimer's disease symptoms such as agitation, what we call a neuropsychiatric disturbances, the cannabis is very effective. Whether it's effective as a part of a package for reversing Alzheimer's, we don't know, but really want to know, because I think their potential is quite there. Especially if you understand the cannabinoid system, you'll know that with aging, the endogenous production of anandamide and other major endogenous cannabinoids drops pretty quickly after age of 50, 55. And so replacing it could make some sense for a lot of medical problems.
Mm-hmm. I've seen particularly remarkable results in Parkinson's patients
Mhm.
and patients with similar, motor dysfunction. I'm wondering what your experience has been with that.
It's interesting that the experience is very heterogeneous, very mixed, and that's part of I think, the challenge. With certain conditions, let's say insomnia or even some intestinal problems like constipation or irritable bowel syndrome, it's extremely predictable. But for more complex issues, the results are kind of all over. I mean, I have some Parkinson's patients who would take some sublingual or inhaled, and sort of all of their motor symptoms get a lot better. And then some for whom it does absolutely nothing. I think we're just at the baby steps of understanding of what's what. And what's interesting, or what's really clearly interesting, is that cannabinoids have so many modes of action. They're not just can relieve a spasm or a pain. I mean, they're anti-inflammatory and they're antiviral, and
Right.
they have so many regulatory functions in our body that I think it's sort of like we're just dipping our toes into entire new field of medicine. I can call it endocannabinoid medicine or something like that.
Right. And I know you have an appreciation for this as Dr. Weil would as well. But as an herbalist myself, one of the things that's often surprising to people or with a more conventional medical background is the understanding that botanicals can have entourage effects, and they also can have adaptogenic type of
Mm-hmm.
effects where a medicinal might work in a certain way in one person given certain circumstances, and it might work in a different way in a different person given other circumstances. And I wonder if you're sort of alluding to that, where the impact and even the mechanism of action of cannabis might differ in different situations, and we really don't yet have a strong understanding of this, in part because of the research ban that's been in place for so many years with cannabis.
I mean, it's even different based on the route you take, based
Right.
on what you ate half an hour ago, based on so many things that it's fascinating. And I think it's such a great example of botanical medicine in principle, and not just how effective it can be, but also sort of how broadly active it is, and how it interplays with our own physiology and our own biochemistry into the to the point where a lot of the things are not just partially predictable, but they have dependence on so many different things. And what's even better for, I think, for our entire field is through the medical cannabis. I think a lot of docs and a lot of regular or standard practitioners are starting to look at the whole field of botanicals a little different, a little more open, more accepting, because they're finally realizing, wait a second, it's the whole plant that tends to work. They've tried giving marinol or any kind of synthetic cannabinoids where impact is, I don't know, 10 times or whatever it is, less potent. So it opens people's eyes to say, wait, why is the botanical working but not synthetic? Well, because that's how it works. And
Yeah.
it took you 30 years to realize that we have this
Right.
very famous expression in Russian language, better late than never. So
Yeah. Yeah, maybe there's something to this wisdom of plant evolution, and all of these compounds that are these thousands sometimes of compounds that are in the plant are playing some role that we with our human brains don't yet fully comprehend, and that it's better we should endeavor to comprehend them and do more research. But in the interim, almost always as an herbalist, I will defer to the whole plant for that reason,
yeah.
because I think
Oh
there's
yeah.
there's so much more um, of a holistic impact there.
Yeah.
And yeah, as you alluded to, we haven't even touched on the differences in strains, broad categories like indica versus sativa, and then even within indica and sativa, all of the
Mhm.
different effects that different strains can have, and the different cannabinoids that have been recently discovered, THC and CBD being the main ones that maybe most people have heard of and are familiar with, but there are other cannabinoids that we know of now that have distinct actions that are different from CBD and THC. And then, as you pointed out, the routes of delivery, like edibles and topicals, and vaporizers and suppositories all lead
Yep.
to a different subjective and even objective measurable effect.
Yep. No, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm sort of more fascinated now with some of the less common cannabinoids. Two in particular, one come to mind is CBDA. It's an
Mm-hmm.
acidic form or cannabidiolic acid form of CBD, which is a comes from raw hemp, and that seems to be very potent anti-inflammatory, specifically for things like arthritis, where you need to have a COX-1, COX-2 inhibition. And
Right.
like for a lot of my older patients, I don't even give them Motrin or Advil because it's actually quite dangerous. They can have bleeding, they can have kidney problems, and CBD actually works quite well for a lot of those kind of a typical age-related arthritis, osteoarthritis, we call it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the CBG is like one of the newest ones, which seems to be a very good mood enhancer and appetite stimulant. So that's one that I find quite often when the THC appetite enhancement is sort of unpredictable. Plus,
Right.
you kind of have to usually smoke it or inhale it, which is probably not the best route for a lot of older
Mm-hmm.
people. And
Sure.
so often you want to give something that's less psychoactive, although psychoactive is a bad word, I guess. Intoxicating would be more appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How about THCA? I've seen some interesting research on its anti-inflammatory
Yeah.
benefits and
Yeah.
anti-convulsant and neuroprotective action. I was thinking of it when you were talking about
Mhm.
cognitive issues and Alzheimer's and even Parkinson's.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I've seen some work done where you would use what's called a quadruple balance strain, like 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 THC, THCA, CBD, CBDA. Yeah, I think THCA is very potent anti-inflammatory. I think it's going to take up its place. I know people who do a lot of neurology. I don't actually do a lot of seizures, but I've heard people say that THCA and to some degree CBDA can be used as anti-seizure quite
Mm,
effectively. Yeah, because if you
mm-hmm.
use CBD for seizures, your doses have to be very high.
Right.
And the issue is also when the doses are very high, you also start wondering about drug CBD interactions because they're real.
Yeah.
And that's a little bit of a versus, CBDA does not have those interactions or THCA.
Yeah, so that was going to be my next question. Actually, is there is research suggesting that very high doses of CBD inhibit cytochrome P450, and that can lead to higher circulating levels of medications,
Mm-hmm.
could interfere with medication. At what dose of CBD do you typically become concerned about that?
Yeah, I think it's actually, at least in part, depends on the patient. I would say somebody who's really frail in the 80s or 90s, I start getting worried over 100 milligrams per day. I think
Mm-hmm.
if somebody is a lot younger, 30s, 40s, like midlife or even younger age, you're probably not going to be, practically speaking, it's probably not going to be that much of a deal until a lot higher dose. Although I have seen actually opioid overdose when CBD was added at high dose, like 200 milligrams, 100 milligrams twice a day. I saw that once. And the patient was not actually very frail. It was late 60s. It was just a lot of back pain. And it was added, CBD was added by the neighbor's suggestion. And then there was that reaction. Yeah.
Tell me about your experience over the last few years in terms of the um, acceptance or lack thereof of medical cannabis, both within the medical community, amongst your colleagues, and also within the geriatric population that you're working with. Because, of course, cannabis has been highly stigmatized for many years, and only recently, I think the general public has started to gain an understanding of its medicinal value. So, what's the typical response from a geriatric patient that you work with when you suggest medical cannabis, and how has that changed over the past, 5 years, if at all?
Shockingly, I think it didn't really change much. I think if you present cannabis as a kind of not the drug that's going to cause other drug overdose or something like that, where you just normalize it and you say, look, well, you have a chance with this, maybe with the cannabis to get off some of the other drugs. I almost never hear an older person saying absolutely not. Um, in fact, think of it this way, right? So most people who are 65 plus probably have tried cannabis recreationally in their, hippie years, right? So
Right.
there is some experience there, and I actually find more resistance among kids, and
Mm.
then suddenly way more acceptance among grandkids. So it's not an atypical situation for me to be in a room with two generations, with three generations, really. And then the grandkids would say, "I told you so. Should have started this years ago." And the kids would sit there with their mouths dropped. Like, what did you tell our 100-year-old mom to start taking marijuana now? Yeah, that's exactly what I said. And you
Yeah.
will be, and she should be putting it in the rectum. And they're like, what?
Mm. Right. Yeah, but that's
And then
over the
you're like,
top for them.
that's, yeah. So, but most of the time conversation is actually not just very easy. It's very encouraging, because they're suddenly realizing it's not a pharmacologic treatment. It's going to have no side effects, and most people really want to try. I
Mhm.
the issue comes up all the time, and it's less for me in the geriatric practice, more in the more of a functional integrative medicine practice, because I do both. If somebody works for federal government, because there's still a
Sure.
zero tolerance policy, and I always, because our clinic is in DC, so I think pretty high proportion of all of our patients at Center for Integrative Medicine is working for the feds. And so we have to ask, and we tell them, look, we can't, if something happens, you get fired, we can't protect you. I'm actually serving quite often as an expert witness in different legal cases on this topic. And, if it's not federal government, believe it or not, on the East Coast, the tide has changed a few years ago. And so most of the patients are actually winning now. I even saw cases won against the local jurisdictions, not just against the, say, some private company, but against like a city of DC, where the person was
Hmm.
fired because they thought she comes in intoxicated, but she was prescribed, recommended correctly, and was taking it for back pain. So it's shifting. I mean, I think the whole field is shifting towards more acceptance. Except, as you said, I mean, I wish our own colleagues within the Western model would shift a little faster. I think a big part of it, first of all, there's just not enough education, right? There's no standard medical curriculum in any of the American medical schools that formally teach practical tools. I mean, they teach addiction, they teach side effects, they teach, sort of consequences of long use of cannabis and all that, but they don't really teach students when they graduate and start working. If somebody asks you, should I use it? Like, students have no idea what to say to that. They don't know how to recommend it. They don't understand the basics. So that has to change, I think, before the whole future of allopathic model will embrace it, because you have no role models in the standard institutions, and then you're not graduating classes that can take that on. It's going to be a gradual process.
That's
Slow
right.
process.
And if you don't educate the physicians and medical professionals adequately, then they don't feel prepared and confident to
Yeah.
be able to make good recommendations, and so they'll just leave it alone and not
Right.
recommend it at all.
Right.
So yeah, I
Yeah.
agree
Absolutely.
100% with that. So I have kind of my process in answer to this question, but I want to ask it to you.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you generally start the let's say that a typical geriatric patient with medical cannabis? Are you beginning with CBD only, or are you using ratios like 4-1 in favor of CBD as a kind of starting place to get them, see how they respond? And how do you think about the ratios of CBD and THC and
Mm-hmm.
in your patient population?
Well, generally speaking, THC always got to go first, for just in terms of the evidence based, and more importantly, in terms of just efficacy. The issue, though, why practically most people try CBD first, is because they have to get a card. And in our area, DC, Maryland, and Virginia, you're looking at, say, 4 to 6 weeks wait period, unless patients on hospice. And if the patient is on hospice, they only really need mostly THC anyway. And so,
Hmm.
really, by the time they get the card, usually I say, why don't you just try some over the internet hemp extract, full extracts first, before, and then see maybe, some say person comes for insomnia, and I say, why don't you try 150 milligrams of CBD at bedtime, and if it's enough, and maybe you can mix it 1-to-1 with CBN, and if it works, great. And actually, then it becomes a lot cheaper too. Although, frankly, it all depends on a dose, because sometimes you can microdose THC and it ends up being way cheaper than even low cost hemp sources. So it's kind of hard to, I think it really depends on the type of a problem, the type of a patient, and what you're sort of trying to do. If you're trying to augment some other therapy, CBD can have a pretty decent role. But if you're really trying to control primary symptom, let's say they're coming in with cancer-related pain, I wouldn't even think of CBD. I just go straight for THC. And ratio there, that's a good question. So like, would I start? I usually start with 1-to-1 THC to CBD for pain, mostly because if you keep increasing CBD, part of the issue is, you actually may have a lower impact. So it may actually
it offsets the effects of THC.
Offset, exactly. So for some conditions, that's a good thing, right? So for some problems, you would want that, but for some, you would not. So again, it's kind of hard. And also, what should be the first route of administration? I think that's also a really big question. If somebody comes in with back pain, I don't think I'm going to be giving them edibles. So I'll just try suppositories as a first line. But if they come in with constipation SIBO, I'll microdose a milligram of enteric-coated THC 3-4 times a day, and that is pretty much one of the most effective adjuncts that I have seen. So it really kind of mostly depends on combination of presenting problem and how strong the body is, because I think that's another thing. If somebody's really frail, you have to be careful with THC. It's kind of easy to overdose, especially if they start. If they don't know, and I have so many stories. I would write a card and then somehow would either not able to talk to the patient, or I didn't write the card, somebody else did, and they end up in dispensary, and 90-year-old gets put on 10 milligrams oral gummy day one, and then I get a call, patient in the emergency room. That happens probably once every few months, unfortunately. That's just not understanding of basic kind of physiology of aging or pharmacokinetics of an aging process. And I wish dispensaries, they're actually getting better. I think in a lot of states, including Maryland recently, they now are required for some kind of a medical educator to make sure that all the staff has some basic medical knowledge, because often, at least in the past, a lot of the bud tenders were high school kids. I'm not kidding.
Right. Yeah. So, no, I've also seen the same shift when I was in California. Now I'm in Utah, which only has medical cannabis, but the general level of understanding in the bud tenders is much, much higher here even than I would say in California, because it's only medical here. And whereas in California you have recreational use, and so a lot of dispensaries were not even oriented towards medicinal use, and the level of education there was fairly low. Some people are probably maybe a little overwhelmed based on the conversation so far, because we're throwing around a lot of terms, and as I'm sure the listeners can gather, there's a lot of nuance here. We're not just talking about buy whatever CBD product that your neighbor recommends, or your friend, or something that you found on the internet. There's a lot of nuance in terms of strain, dose, route of administration, etc. And I want to come back to dose in a moment, because I think this is an area where people really falter, and not because of their just due to lack of education. So let's talk about that now, and then I'll come back to what I was going to ask you. You said someone could take 100 milligrams of CBN for insomnia. Now, most consumer products that you would buy, the suggested dose I found is way too low. So talking about, on the bottle, it might say take something that ends up being 5 milligrams, or you might sometimes see 25 milligrams. And then patient will come to me and say, well, I tried CBD or
And it
CBN or
didn't
whatever.
do
It didn't
anything.
work. And
Right.
I'm like, how
That's
much did
right.
you take? And they're like, I took
That's right.
5 milligrams. I'm like,
Right.
that's like a homeopathic dose of CBD.
Well, I
So,
think I think the idea here is I actually do start very low. Like you mentioned
mhm,
CBN. I don't think anybody ever gonna need that high of a dose per day. Although
yeah,
some people may, but I would typically start CBD or or some kind of mix at somewhere between 10 to 15 milligrams of CBD equivalent, and then go up.
yeah,
And that does two things. Well, one, you decrease any chances of any kind of side effects, but two, you widen the therapeutic window. It's a pretty unusual concept. If you take a medication, if you take a same dose day 1, 2, 3, and 4, you're not necessarily expecting that on a day 5 there's going to be a more significant impact from the same exact dose. Unless the medication accumulates, and there are some. But with cannabinoids, it's interesting that often if you give a same small dose and then you start increasing the dose gradually, the increment of increase achieves a lot bigger suddenly boost of efficacy than you would expect. And that's that kind of the widening of therapeutic effect. That's why you start low and you keep titrating until you hit the kind of a sweet spot, and then you stop. That's another huge mistake. People often kind of think, okay, so I got myself to 7.5 milligrams of THC at night for insomnia. Well, I want to sleep an extra hour. Let me take 15 milligrams. And then
yeah. And
boom, and
then they're
next
waking
day
up.
they're like
Yeah,
headaches and they actually sleep less, not
yeah,
more. So like there's also this principle of kind of this U-shape effect. So you have to find that most effective window and then stay in it. And if you do need to increase periodically, sometimes it does happen. You go up, but again, you're titrating it very gradually. I would say the only exception to this rule is pain, and a lot of people come in with severe chronic pain. Sometimes we go up very quickly, like we're not waiting for a week on the subtherapeutic dose of 5 days. We'll go a couple of days of a low dose and then very quickly taper up like by 50% each subsequent dose until they feel some pain relief. It's probably the only exception I can, well, maybe severe nausea. It's kind of the same as well.
hmm. So the question I was going to ask was, given all of this complexity, where should someone start? And I know the answer will depend on, are they working with a clinician that's knowledgeable in this area? Let's assume for the time being that someone's just listening to this podcast, and they live in a state where the recreational use is not permitted, so they're going to be limited to products that you can buy legally on the internet that are made from hemp. And just to clarify for all the listeners, there are CBD products that are made from cannabis plant, marijuana, that you cannot buy online, and then there are CBD products that are made from hemp that you can buy online. So maybe let's start there, because I think it's probably going to be the majority of listeners who either don't live in a state where they can, get marijuana products on their own, or if they do, they're not comfortable because they don't have someone who's guiding them. And so what advice would you offer in terms of where to start with CBD products that you can buy online?
Yeah, well, so first of all, let's just talk about general, right? Because there's so many CBD companies. Like, I'm not gonna single anybody or say that this is my favorite. I think that would be not appropriate. But I would say that they must be organic. Ideally, the brand should really be somehow that you can figure out what it is. Meaning, if the product arrives, God knows from where, and you have no way of testing this product, it's you're risking. So if you know the brand and you know where they making the product, and you can figure it out, you know where they're growing it, that's probably best. Because unfortunately, as you pointed out, right, in hemp products, the amount of CBD compared to cannabis products is less. And so they have to extract a lot larger volume of plant. And if the original plant had contaminant, guess what? You're going to concentrate the contaminant into the product you're taking. And unfortunately, there have been deaths from mold toxicity from poor quality hemp. There's already several cases that have been reported. So you really have to be super careful with that. So that's even before you think about what exactly should you be getting. I think after that, I would say if you're going to try CBD and you want to start somewhere between, say, 10 to 15 milligrams twice a day, and very gradually titrating up. The advantage is if you're not on any medications, or if you don't have any kind of a severe life-altering illness, chances are you're not going to see a lot of side effects. And if you taper gradually, say maybe first 2-3 days, keep the dose at say 15 milligrams twice a day, and then start tapering after that. You can taper 30-50% per day after that until you feel something. And if you get to a point where you say taking more than 200 milligrams a day and it's doing nothing, you can probably say at that point, okay, well, it's not working, we have to think of something else, like combination, so there should be something else. Usually that's a very general statement because we're not taking into consideration specifics of the patient, specifics of the problem. I would say if you have any rheumatologic condition, so any kind of joint pain, whether it's osteoarthritis or some other form of arthritis like rheumatoid arthritis, I'd go straight for CBDA. And the advantage of CBDA, you can taper it up as much as you want. And somewhere between, I would say, 100 milligrams to 300 milligrams a day, most patients are going to have a definite improvement. I wouldn't say 100%, but way over 50%. And those are the patients that then can start tapering down some of the medications. And that's another blessing. If you say have rheumatoid arthritis and you're taking some immune suppressants, there's going to be no interaction there. So you can taper up CBDA, get a lot better, and then consider tapering things down. And of course, you and I know very well, it wouldn't be our only treatment, right? I mean, we would be giving the same patient so many other recommendations that it'll be part of it. But so if acidic forms, risk is pretty small. CBG, CBN, CBC, risk is pretty small in terms of interactions. I think the CBD is the one you have to worry about. That's why I kind of typically, if the patient is old and frail, I'll cap their dose at 100 milligrams unless I know that they're not on any medications that I'm worried about. Unfortunately, that's a rarity
pretty
in my
rare
practice.
Yeah.
So I always have to worry about something out there, but everybody else, you probably can go way higher, 200, 300, 400 milligrams. I mean, the Epidiolex given to kids with seizure meds, and they go up to 500, 1,000 milligram in combination with seizure meds. Most of those will interact with CBD, and they're not too concerned. I mean, they're not seeing a lot of shift, but I actually question that. I wonder if we just the matter of time before we see problems.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about THC and the therapeutic use of it, because I, at least in some of my patients, they're a lot more open to taking CBD than they are to taking THC because they're concerned about the psychoactive effects. They either don't have experience with cannabis products and they're worried because of what they've heard and maybe some of the stereotypes in movies and stuff like that, of just being stoned, or they have had experience in the past and maybe it wasn't positive because they weren't using it in a controlled or regulated way, and
or
so
they took a dose that was way too high off the start.
way too high. Exactly. They didn't have a controlled dosage. They were smoking and they didn't have any idea how to titrate how much they needed. So I guess the first question is, how do you kind of broach that with patients? And then the second question is, for people who do want the therapeutic effect of THC, but maybe don't want the psychoactive effects as much, particularly during the daytime, if they're working or and have to function in a way where they don't have that alteration of their consciousness. How do you approach that in your practice?
Right. That's a great question. It's very, very important topic. So that widening the therapeutic window, so starting subtherapeutic, so starting at the dose, I mean, I would typically start between 0.5 to 1 milligram per dose in that range. And with that dose, most people will not get to any kind of psychotoxic impact at all. And you'll stay there for a few days and then you start tapering very slowly up until you hit the sweet spot. So that tends to work for a lot of people. Now, you're absolutely correct. If you take a therapeutic dose in the morning and it's pure THC, you may feel like it's really hard to function. So I think that's what you mentioned. That's when you try then to put much higher dose of CBD to sort of decrease the impact of the psychoactivity and kind of level it. And somewhere
Hmm.
between 4 to 1 to maybe 10 or 20 to 1, most people kind of have that. They can't function at that ratio. The problem is, though, sometimes that just not doesn't control symptoms very well. So
Right.
if that's the case, then you really have to sort of figure out what would be their ideal ratio. That's why I often start, if it's a pain, with 1 to 1. To me, that often is that kind of you take off the edge of the psychotoxic effect down a little bit, but it's not that much of CBD to kind of cause a drop in the pain control of THC. That's, to me, that seems to work. Interestingly, sometimes you can do what I often love to do is either triple topical or triple preparations. They're very rare, though, in my opinion. I haven't seen a lot of
Yeah.
them. That's
Yeah.
the THC, CBD, and CBDA. Because if you think about it, most of the pain is going to have some severe inflammatory component of some sort. And it's not always, it's very common to be some arthritic component or some COX. For listeners who don't know this is just the type of inflammatory process that
Pathway. Hmm.
mediated, right? It's mediated through that. And that's where the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories such as Advil and Motrin tend to work well. So CBDA there could be a great substitute for the NSAIDs, which I hate passionately.
Yeah.
Well,
And
they're
it's,
just I've seen so many side effects. Like, I'm not
yeah,
talking about my stomach hurts. I'm talking about I'm coming in with bleeding ulcer, or my kidneys shutting down.
absolutely. Yeah. People are unaware. I mean, these things are sort of treated as if they're completely benign. I'm sure we both had lots of patients who've taken them every day for years, particularly in the geriatric population, because their aches and pains, they want to stay active, which is totally understandable, and they've gotten in the habit of taking 2 or 3 Advil every time before they exercise, and then
That's right.
they develop an ulcer, and they wonder why that happened, and
So that's a perfect example for all of those people who pop a couple of peels of Motrin before exercising. Take CBDA, and it's
yeah,
actually, it works a lot better. I mean, it also
yeah,
causes this. There is a little bit of I wouldn't say euphoria, but it does have some kind of an uplifting impact.
yeah,
And it doesn't have, not only no toxicity, it's also, if it makes you feel a little bit better on not just the physical plane but also the mental, I mean, why not?
absolutely. And like
Um,
you said, it's quite a blessing to have something like this that also doesn't interact with the majority of the medications that people are taking, which is can be really, really tricky otherwise to find treatments that don't interact or cause additional side effects.
Absolutely. And if
Yeah.
you take this interview, say 3 years ago, we would have much harder time talking about CBDA because the price was crazy.
Right.
Now the prices have come down so much, and I'm pretty sure they will keep coming down slowly. I don't think
Hmm.
we anywhere near sort of the bottom of the standard price. That I think it wouldn't be surprising that we'll at some point reach the kind of a
Yeah.
less than like $1 for a
Sure.
milligram, somewhere in that
Yeah.
range.
Supply and demand,
I mean,
as more the word
for
gets out.
100
Um,
milligrams, not the.
yeah.
So yeah. No, because right now the prices could easily be, somewhere around like 1,000 milligrams. If you're buying it more than $50, you're overpaying. I think
Yeah.
we can at some point hit the mark where 1,000 milligrams will be $10-15. I think when we
Hmm.
get to that level of cost, if we ever will, I think it's going to be so accessible. And I'm talking about the cost should eventually be roughly equivalent between certain cannabinoids. The acidics will always be a little more expensive because their extraction requires a lot more gentleness and it's more complicated extraction. But they may be twice the cost. So $20 for 1,000 milligrams of CBDA, but right now you pay way more than that on
Hmm.
average.
So I'm going to reveal my bias here. Do you ever get concerned that big pharma is going to see
Yeah,
what's
could take
happening here
over. Oh yeah,
and say, hey, wait a second, we're not profiting on this, and
right, right.
lobby the federal government or um, to make these products unavailable without a prescription.
I think if you'd, my opinion changes on this topic. So if you asked me this a couple of years ago, when there was this kind of a debacle ongoing where GW Pharmaceutical tried to literally prohibit medical cannabis in several states in America, or they lobbied for the federal, local governments to do so, and they totally failed. I think the train left the station. That's my sense. I think people really appreciate the medical cannabis, and more importantly, I think the local governments, the state governments, are really getting enriched, and they're getting way more enriched from botanical form that they will ever get from medical and from the prescription drugs, and they know that. So I think that the future, generally speaking, of botanical is bright. I think what is not bright is where is the actual medical system. I think the pharma will try to kind of go after docs and say, look, don't recommend botanicals, just prescribe our drugs. I think that will happen, but I don't think it'll be so broad and so strong. I think eventually the field will coexist. I'm optimistic too much, and maybe I should be more pessimistic. But to me, it just feels. I really think that the drugs made out of cannabis are just almost always will be inferior. It'll take them a lot of time to figure out how to sort of create the sort of the in vitro or in tube entourage effect, if you will, right? I think there will be always a step behind. And also, the field is still so heavily relying on biohackers and tons of experimentation. It's such a rapidly growing field that a lot of this fine details are going to be completely out of the reach for pharma, because it takes years, if not decades, to research on a grand scheme any particular ingredient. And so, if you have somebody trying something and in 6 months they have a new product that people can try and they will go and try it, I think that's the sort of the renaissance, if you will, of the whole field. How long it will last, I mean, I think short of some major regulatory change, which, I mean, I'm crossing fingers it's not going to happen. My only hope is that there's some rescheduling, better yet descheduling, because we didn't really talk about it, but being Schedule 1, that's another main reason why a lot of docs really don't want to get involved, because they somehow afraid, even though the fears are unfounded. But there's still some docs who are really like, I don't want to deal with anything Schedule 1. Like I'm not going there. And you have to kind of respect that, because the way the traditional system set up, if it's Schedule 1, it means very addictive and no benefits. So
right, and probably more liability, I think,
exactly.
as well.
Yeah.
So
and
for physicians.
A lot of docs don't know that there's been several legal steps, both by federal and by most of the local states, just to protect the docs. In fact, if you look at how most of the medical cannabis laws are created, they separating docs from the dispensaries 100%. So if I'm recommending medical cannabis and I kind of write for the card, I'm actually in District of Columbia. Well, it's used to be when they just came out with this. I was not allowed to tell the patient where to go, what to buy, and how to take it. Like I was legally, they were telling me if I recommend, I'm not allowed to say this. And I'm like, excuse me, when is the last time I wrote a prescription for something and I wasn't able to discuss side effects, efficacy, and dosing? Like, are you kidding me? So I've been very angrily vocal against the DC government on this topic. They finally sort of lost that addendum in there. They said, okay, fine, you can discuss whatever you need to discuss about any products, but you can't own any part of dispensary. Okay, well, that makes perfect sense, right? I mean, that would be direct conflict of interest. But it's still there's still this kind of a legal separation attempt, because as a Schedule 1, the states have to make some formal protective mechanism for their docs. Otherwise, the patient can say, wait a second, you gave me a Schedule 1 drug, I have a side effect, you're responsible. So that's actually, most doctors don't know that they're completely protected if they start writing recommendations, because of the states may take that step to separate doctors from dispensaries. So they literally take the responsibility for the products on themselves. The states responsible, well, most of the states responsible for making sure products in dispensaries are good, that dispensaries and manufacturer follow the good manufacturing processes of GMP, and that they're actually in compliance with all the manufacturing and testing and everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, that's actually, I only have experience with 2 states, but in Utah, it seems to be just a higher quality experience for people because it is all medical.
Mm-hmm.
And there are, I think, higher standards that the dispensaries have to adhere to in order to continue operating. And every patient who uses cannabis is getting, counseling from the clinician that prescribes it in terms of how to use it. And then the bud tenders that at the dispensaries have a higher level of education. Whereas in California, because recreational use was permitted, people could just tend to walk into any dispensary on any street corner and
Mm-hmm. Yeah, whatever.
get who
Yeah,
knows what,
exactly.
and not really have. So I have mixed feelings about it. It's I'm all for making this medicine accessible, and at the same time there I can make a strong argument for doing it in a way that is most likely to benefit you and least likely to harm you. And I think
Right. No,
that's
absolutely.
still generally working through the medical route. Even in California, we would always refer our patients to medical dispensaries, and there's certain dispensaries in California that, even though recreational use is permitted, they only accept and work with
Mm-hmm.
medical patients. So how do you approach that, like when you're
Yeah,
advising people?
same. I mean, I really, not necessarily that I despise the recreational use, but I don't really associate what I do with any of it. And,
Yeah.
you know, unfortunately, what I'm seeing a lot is a kind of a gravitation towards this kind of a larger sales and automatically towards more recreational. And it's unfortunate. I think the separation between the medical and recreational needs to be a lot more obvious, because right now, well, you just described California, but in a lot of states, the only difference is the sort of the maximum dose per bottle or maximum concentration. I don't think that's enough. I think there has to be a much more specific separation, and sort of what are you going to call recreational, or what are you going to sell in recreational and what in medical. And as you pointed out, I think it sounds like in Utah you guys have a pretty good system, because it's not in every state that the some kind of a guidance to the patients is required. In a lot of states, docs would write and recommendation and tell the patient, well, now go to any dispensary, get whatever you need to get, and just
Yeah.
like leave it at that, right? And that's where a lot of problems occur. If that's the style of practice, unfortunately, I would say it's, in best case scenario, 50-50 that the patient will get relief and will stick with the products, because it's just so many incorrect recommendations. And if the state regulates the recommendation internally, like say Connecticut or Maryland or Illinois, they require for each dispensary to have either a pharmacist or a clinician on staff in dispensary available all the time for the counseling of the patients. But a lot of states don't have that. And, I think it hopefully will go towards that route. And that's what will truly separate medical versus recreational. But
Yeah.
it's actually, this part is very hard to predict. There's so much money on the table. And I think there's such a heavy, it's such a politically tinged field that I'm afraid that we may end up going heavily towards recreational, because states that have passed the recreational laws, they make so much money. They don't want to lose that.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been impressed with how Utah does it. When you write a prescription, then first of all, there are only providers who want to be able to write prescriptions have to go through a process. And
Mm-hmm.
so, and then they have to agree to counsel the patient and help them understand, why it's being prescribed, how to use it properly. And then the card has to be renewed every 6 months, and during that renewal process, part of that is a check is a checkup with the clinician who prescribed it, where the clinician asks how it's going. They can modify the dose or the strain, or the route of administration. And even in Utah, smoking is not permitted. So
Huh. Wow.
you can only buy vaporizers and edibles, and combustion is not allowed. So the
So
temperature
there is
is
no dry flower. So you can only buy
no,
cartridges.
you can buy dry
Ah,
flour,
you can.
but it only use a device that heats it with convection rather
Ah,
than
uh-huh.
combustion.
Like a
So I
volcano
think
or
that,
something.
yeah, the temperature is limited to something like 420 degrees as a maximum. So it's not combusting,
Hmm.
and which is healthier for the lungs if you are going to inhale it.
Right,
So
right.
yeah, they've been pretty intentional about how they set it up here, and
I have not heard this, and it's fascinating because it's every 6 months. Almost all the states do it once a year, and some states actually allowing every other year. But 6 months I haven't heard that even.
yeah,
That's actually, I think that makes a ton of sense because it basically pushes people to see a doc twice a year, or a person who recommends, and
yeah.
hopefully that person can actually guide them, not just write the card.
Yeah, and I've found that they're generally highly trained and knowledgeable.
Mhm.
So it's an interesting system, and I hope more states adopt it because it really makes a lot of sense. So I
Mhm.
want to talk a little bit about your book. I mean, we've been talking
Yeah,
about your book the entire time, really.
that's right. That's right.
What's in your book? So everything that we've been talking about in the show is in your book. Everything from understanding the legal aspects of
Mhm.
cannabis, the risks and benefits of the various cannabinoids and compounds, the pros and cons of the various routes of delivery, from edibles to topicals to suppositories. Talk how to find reliable dispensaries, um, cost saving strategies. What are you most excited about with this book, which I think comes out on October 21st? Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. I think really, my hope was when we started writing is just to kind of put my general thought process in and put it in a very accessible form. There are tons of great cannabis books out there, but I think this is a first book that can be read as a novel, basically, even though the chapters are distinct. Like, you go from one clinical chapter to another, but they're filled with the patient's stories. They written not necessarily like a novel, but they're written in a very simple, accessible language. So I think that excites me, that somebody can read this and not think about the book as a kind of a desktop reference where you just open a particular page you're looking at the index, right? That people actually will read it so that they grasp the whole totality of the field rather than, oh, I just want to take a little bit of CBDA here because the doctor said so, right? That doesn't that doesn't lead the shift in perspective. It just leads to, oh, yet another, tool, or another, what are we calling this? Greenopathy, right? But
Yeah,
we're trying to position the product as a kind of this entry point into the holistic integrative medicine so that people can start grasping that when you start interacting with the natural products at this depth of the level, you really start understanding not only your own individual complexity, but how is the nature interacting with us. And I think we put a lot of intentionality and a lot of kind of specific little, what do we call them, sidebars, or like little pieces of
mm-hmm.
information where we highlight some of those fascinating factoids. And
Yeah,
some of them, like for example, a very simple historic fact: you go thousands of years back and the cannabis was with us and it was used for all kinds of symptom relief. I mean, we're talking
yeah,
about 5,000-6,000 years ago. It's sort of like, it's fascinating that now, thousands of years later, we're finally saying, oh yeah, it does work. I mean, right?
yeah.
Like, so
Yeah, we figured
yeah,
this out. Look at
yeah.
us. Yeah, that's pretty commmmon with botanical medicine, right?
That's it,
It's
right?
kind of
And it's sort of like, so to me, that's really exciting. I don't really see myself as quote unquote cannabis expert. I think there are docs who practice purely cannabinoid medicine or endocannabinoid medicine. I think they're way more knowledgeable than me. But for me, it became a critical part of my toolbox, especially for the geriatric population, that I had to speak up about it. I felt strongly, and plus, I found this, I call her my New York mother, Joan and Liebman Smith, and so we kind of partnered. And it's really, the book is written in her voice, and she tried to represent my voice, but it's really her writing, because you can sense, hear my accent. My writing is horrible. You don't want me to write anything, but she was really kind of represented my voice. We did a lot of, I would dictate to her. We would just sit there and I will tell her a patient story. She'll record it with a tape recorder, and then kind of try to put some of my words down, but modify them so it actually can appropriately a comprehensible material.
Yeah, that's great. I love the stories too, because I think that's really accessible for people who are reading, to be able to relate to the material.
And every case is a real case. I mean, we had to modify certain factoids and names, but we based every case on a real story from my practice.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Kogan, it's been a pleasure to speak with you. I know people are going to get a ton out of this podcast. It was so educational, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about cannabis and medical cannabis. So I'm really happy to be able to recommend your book. It's called Medical Marijuana: Dr. Kogan's Evidence-Based Guide to the Health Benefits of Cannabis and CBD. You can buy it on Amazon and wherever books are sold, and I highly recommend it for both individuals and non-medical folks, just to learn how to use cannabis and CBD for yourself, and also we have a lot of practitioners and other medical professionals who listen to the show. So I definitely, if you're a clinician, highly recommend this book as a way of educating yourself on how to better serve your patients. Really, no matter what age they are, and there's so many conditions that cannabis can help with. So, Dr. Kogan, thanks again for joining us on the show.
Thank you, Dr. Kresser. It was wonderful, and thank you so much for all the great work you do, and keep up. I mean, we need as much education to the public about things you do as we can. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks everyone for listening. Keep sending your questions to chriskresser.com/podcast question, and we'll see you next time. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresserlac. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.